Like, okay, the baseline is I would learn something, I would grow. I'm 21, 22 years old. That's okay. That's a lot, actually. And instead of saying, am I going to be the one to save the Bosnians? If you set that up as your standard, you're going to fail by definition, and you won't go because you know you're going to fail. But I just to stress, I think the hardest moment for anyone who doesn't like what they see around them, who feels as if there's some injustice that should be remedied, but the first thought they have is, "But I'm so small. I'm one person. Like, what can one person do?" It's just I hear it so very often. We all do, and we all feel it. And President Obama felt it at times, even when he was the most powerful person in the universe, arguably. Um, for me, working in my 20s and getting exposure, as you say, to what was happening in Bosnia, it wasn't just that. Suddenly, I had all these people who the person I was working for was encountering, who were showing that there were all of these pathways working at an NGO, helping refugees or delivering humanitarian assistance, writing editorials to try to pressure somebody, being a physician and excavating mass graves to document crimes. There was the new court at The Hague. You could be a lawyer and potentially hunt down, the perpetrators of these crimes. I think where people get hung up is, there's a saying I think which is can implies ought. And if you can't see the can, if there's no pathway, it's often people sort of stymie themselves and don't get to the what I ought to do because I know I can't. So why ought I? Why do I make myself just feel bad that I'm not doing the thing that I know I can't do? And so for me, and what I hope I do in the book is open up the universe of ways, even in such tiny ways, that you can, and then that allows, I think, people to develop what your question came to, which was what ought one do? And for Bosnia, I would not have characterized myself as pro intervention as a general proposition. My instincts were, I was quite small minded in a way. I was just living within the universe of what was happening in this one country of 4+ million, where half the people had been displaced, where the perpetrators weren't backed really in a significant way by any major power. By the standards of certainly today's conflicts, a pretty straightforward picture. I mean, it didn't feel straightforward to policymakers, I grant, but when I couldn't get to work at an NGO or a think tank or anything because I had no qualifications to do so, I ended up going over there as a war correspondent, believing, as a freelancer, believing that if we could somehow tell the story in a vivid way, if we could bridge the distance between what was happening on the ground and the decision-making circles where people were hanging back, that could be influential. I did not go over believing it would be. I was just a kid, I was in my early 20s, but I thought, I will learn. I'll learn the language, I'll learn the history, I'll learn even how the UN works and doesn't work on the ground. I'll learn about where US ideals meet the reality of post-Cold War ethnic conflict. And I developed this kind of framework for every decision point in my life, which was if all I get out of this is X, and in that case it was learning the language and learning the history, will it have been worth it? And I think for people who feel paralyzed by the prospect of making an impact, I think that test that in one's own mind is like, if all I get out of this is, and whatever X is for any given person, any given crossroads, it's kind of freeing because it's like, okay, the baseline is I would learn something, I would grow. I'm 21, 22 years old. That's okay. That's a lot, actually. And instead of saying, am I going to be the one to save the Bosnians? If you set that up as your standard, you're going to fail by definition, and you won't go because you know you're going to fail.
I mean, why have you told the story of your home life and parents split? I mean, basically, your mother took you to America because your parents broke up. I mean, obviously that's a formative story, and these things are formative in anyone's lives. But how do you think it has made you the sort of the person you are in terms of what you do and how you think?
Well, I never thought that being an immigrant would be so noteworthy as it has become in our current politics. And so, again, there are a lot of different ways to write in the current moment. You can go right at the move away from, I think, what it makes America a very special place with its diversity and its, uh, for all of its flaws, its inclusivity. As the current president moves away from that, I could have written something saying that's terrible. Immigration is great. Look at all the economic returns. Instead, I just tell you my story, my simple story of getting to come to this country with many more advantages than a lot of immigrants have, namely speaking English and coming, from a tradition that, has a lot in common with the American tradition. In telling my story to just show, not tell, what America has offered, and then how one person who happens to be an immigrant has taken advantage of what America has offered to try to give back in some, again, small ways.
Because you only became an American citizen in your 20s.
Yeah, and just before I went to, or just as I was going back and forth to Bosnia for the first time in '93,
So was your identity Irish
I
or
think,
American or
as
what?
I as is true, I think of many whose parents sort of take them as a kid. To this day, I don't think my mother really even knows. But when I got on the plane to come to America, I did not think it was forever. I thought I was gonna go have the best of all worlds, stay Irish. Who doesn't want to be Irish? And I'd learn about American sports, and my mother would get to run away with the man she loved, who was now my stepfather all these years later, a Dublin doctor like her. There was no divorce in Ireland back then. It came about really relatively recently. And so for her to be with the person she loved and to pursue advances in medicine, she was going. So I like internalized all of that as a kid, just thinking, oh, it's a good opportunity for mom and a great wonderland for any kid to move to this large, kind of bounty, cornucopia, even just going to the grocery store, turning on the television. We had the three channels in Ireland. One of them was in Irish. And suddenly you have all of these channels and all of this opportunity. And so as a kid, you just kind of skating by. But my father, one of the reasons my mother left him was that he was an alcoholic, and it was becoming more and more of his vocation was to be a pub goer. More and more of my life was spent with my dad in the pub before we left to move to America, and I think my mother was very worried about pub life and kids and for all the obvious reasons, but she was also busy with her career and, not as much of a counterweight as she wanted to be to those exposures. And when I got to America not long after, a few years later, my father died, what to me was very, very sudden, basically at age 47, having drank himself to death, and particularly accelerated what was already happening before we left, accelerating that after we left. And so, why do I write about all of that? It is a little, maybe to some kind of TMI, as they say. I think that, when you become a cabinet member of the president of the United States or UN ambassador, there's some idea that your road is linear, rather than human and vulnerable. And I lived in my youth and really up until, I'm sure I look back even now when I'm 49 years old at still feeling some version of this, but I lived with for a long time with a sense of responsibility that I stayed in Ireland as a child, not that I could have stayed without my mother, but kids exaggerate their agency in these moments, but that had I stayed, I would have been reason enough for my dad to give up the drink or to lighten up on the drink, and I felt guilty. I felt immensely responsible. And therapists through the years, when I write in the book about how much I hated therapy when it was forced upon me by my friends who thought I was making poor romantic choices and thought that they may be rooted in my childhood, which was like psychobabble 101 as far as I could tell. But once I overcame that resistance and really delved into it, I really, from a personal standpoint, I was afraid of being close to people, no question. And so to go to war zones and to be flitting from one dangerous place to another where you never got too close, you may have gotten close to the story, but you didn't allow yourself really to establish roots. That probably was not unrelated to this fear that if I again allowed myself to love in the way that I had loved my dad, that would also vanish as he had, very abruptly. But also a sense that, probably, maybe somewhere, at least this is what the shrinks will tell you, that if you have the chance when you're older and you do have agency, to try to look out for somebody who isn't in control of their destiny, use that chance. And so in a way, to harness that regret and that pain in as constructive a way as I could. Now, again, my story isn't about that epiphany driving me to Bosnia. It was about Bosnia driving me to Bosnia. And I resist the therapeutic accounts that root everything in childhood because I want to live in a world where the fact that people were being targeted with genocide in Bosnia is intrinsic reason enough, even if you've had a comfortable childhood where both your parents are thriving. And so it's complicated why any of us end up doing what we do. But I do definitely feel at least the privilege of having had the chance given to me by Barack Obama to be in a position, again, to look out for people who don't really have voices on the international stage.